you for joining us today for our Clinical Trials Methodology course webinar. The topic today is on partnering with industry. Before we begin, I want to remind you to please mute your phones when not speaking. You may unmute to ask questions or type your questions in the chat feature at the top of your screen. Also, please make certain to evaluate this webinar, especially if you would like CME credit for attending today. The link to the evaluation is in the chat box. And lastly, please mark your calendars for our next webinar on July 2nd at noon Eastern. The topic is Data and Safety and AE Reporting. So I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Jeffrey Saver is Professor and SA Vice Chair of Neurology at UCLA and Director of the UCLA Comprehensive Stroke and Vascular Neurology Program. He trained at Harvard Medical School, the Harvard Longwood Neurology Training Program for Neurology, the University of Iowa for Neurobehavior, and Brown University for Vascular Neurology. Author of over 600 research articles, 2 books, and 40 book chapters, Dr. Saver's research interests are in acute stroke treatment, stroke prevention, neuroimaging, clinical trial design, and neurocognitive consequences of stroke. He served as PI of the NIH-NINDS FAST-MAG trial, global co-PI of the SWIFT PRIME trial, and chair of the American Heart Association Stroke Council. He is currently Associate Editor at JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and Consulting Editor at the journal Stroke. So I would like to give a warm thank you to Dr. Saver today for his time and presentation.
Thank you very much, Joy, and hello, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking with you about this delicate topic of working with industry in clinical trials for academicians. I'll begin by showing my disclosures, which also are in some way my qualifications for giving this talk, which does demonstrate that I have had a variety of interactions with industry as an academic. And so I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of the relationship, which I'll try to capture in the talk today. I will note to set the stage that we have the great privilege of practicing neurology and doing neurologic research in the age of neurotherapeutics, where neurology is now an emphatically therapeutic discipline. Back when I first started training in 1988, it was said that neurologists just did diagnose and adios because there were no therapies for patients, but now it's greet and treat, and that's due to randomized controlled trials. There's if you look at the 8 leading causes of neurologic disease worldwide as listed here, 7 of them have available therapies that resulted from clinical trials. So 91% of the worldwide burden of neurologic disease is now treatable. And that is not just due to trials per se, but largely due to trials that were sponsored by industry. If you look in my own field of stroke, acute ischemic stroke care, when I first finished residency in 1990, I'll show you the list of all the therapies that had positive trials and wide practice adoption. Actually, in fact, I've already shown it to you. We didn't have any. It was a blank list. And then by last year, we had all of these therapies that have been developed over the last 2.5 decades. And if you look at how much industry contributed to these, the majority of advances have had industry funding and collaboration in the pivotal trials to some and often a substantial degree. In fact, if you look at the number of trials that industry is funding versus what NIH is funding, industry is funding the great preponderance of interventional trials, and it's increasing. Here's a study from the 10-year period of 2006 to 14 showing that among trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov, the industry-funded trials increased to over 6,000 being registered per year, while the NIH-funded trials declined to about 1,000 being registered per year. And by the 2014, the last year with data, 86% of the interventional trials were being funded by industry. So for better or for worse, and often it's for better and sometimes it's for worse, industry is the major driver of pivotal clinical trial research in the US. And so working with industry is very important for any academic neurologist who's interested in clinical trials. Well, what should we think about industry's involvement? And here's two perspectives. First, the skeptical perspective. Here's a quote from Ben Goldacre, who is perhaps the leading curmudgeon critic of industry involvement in science of the moment. And in his book, Bad Pharma, How Drug Companies Mislead Doctors and Harm Patients, he wrote that drugs are tested by the people who manufacture them in poorly designed trials on hopelessly small numbers of weird, unrepresentative patients and analyzed using techniques which are flawed by design in such a way that they exaggerate the benefits of treatments. This is the perspective that you can't trust industry, that they tilt the playing field, and the data that comes out of their trials is completely unreliable. On the other side, here, if you go to the website innovation.org, which is the website of the lobbying group of America's biopharmaceutical companies, here we have a much more optimistic Panglossian view of the role of industry in clinical trials due to progress in biopharmaceutical researchers' understanding and use of genetic sequencing, real-world data, computational science. America's biopharmaceutical companies are now more than ever before prepared to respond to the tremendous unmet medical needs experienced by patients throughout the United States. So between this glass half empty and glass half full extreme perspectives, I would suggest that the best take on the role of industry is an intermediate one, that with careful oversight by smart regulation and careful attention by academics who are working with industry to being aware of industry's distinctive incentives and the need for the academics to bring a countervailing perspective, that one can walk a middle line that brings the special expertise, resources, and reach of industry to channel it to discover neurologic advances in an efficient manner that comes out of the more pure exploratory neurologic science that academics tend to do well. So part of the skepticism that Ben Goldacre's quote reflects how things were 15 years ago, 20 years ago in the field. And in the intervening time, we have had, among the different authorities that control the ecosystem of clinical trial conduct, a variety of advances in regulation that have really transformed and cleaned up how trials are done. And I think that when you read about industry relations in clinical trials, a lot of people are still speaking to how things were in 2000. They're out of touch and they don't realize how much better things are now. So we used to have problems that investigators had financial conflicts of interest that were undeclared, paid by the sponsors, or they were inventors who created devices and had patents. This is now mitigated by journals who require reporting by all authors of their conflicts of interest, by governmental regulation with the Physician Payment Sunshine Act that is reported at quarterly, all payments to physicians, and with the decision that by NIH that academic medical centers are the bodies that should manage their faculty conflicts of interest and putting a guardian in charge. We used to have the problem with non-publication of negative trials if pharma did, or even academics did a trial and it turned out to be against the hoped for hypothesis. Sometimes those results would not see the light of day. But now both the FDA and the major journals require that trials be registered before they start, else they won't be published or be able to be conducted. And they now require that the results of the trials be reported. And also academic medical centers now have their contracts for clinical trials written with pharma where the academics retain publication rights that the industry is not allowed to suppress the results, although you still see that in contract language. Just last week, I had to take a gag rule out of a contract that we were being offered, but that's now in place. We used to have p-hacking, where you'd look at 10 endpoints and there'd be reporting only of the positive ones, but now both FDA and the major medical journals require that the primary endpoint be pre-specified in the trial registration so that you can't play three-card Monte with the primary endpoint. There used to be guest authorship where pharma would do the trial, but an academic's name would be slapped on the paper without major contribution to design, conduct, or analysis. That's beginning to be addressed. Several journals now require that there be a declaration that the first draft of papers were written by the academic authors. And then finally, we have the problem of data sequestration, that the primary data from the trial was not being made public, and that kept others from independently replicating the results, plus prevented secondary analyses by crowd science. And the regulators in the US and Europe, FDA, EMA, now have data transparency programs and regulations. The journals have started requiring data sharing statements. We're not to the point where there's required sharing of individual patient data, but we've perhaps begun the journey to that. And as a result of these changes, the world is very different now, and it's a much healthier environment for these trials. So here is my city, Los Angeles, in the 1990s versus 2016, and you can see we had smog and pollution in the 1990s in LA and in our clinical trials, but due to regulation, we now have clean air and a fairly clean clinical trial conduct environment. Now, another aspect when thinking about industry involvement in trials is to think about this ecosystem of and the fate map of compounds being developed for potential clinical use. Now, this does come from the pharmaceutical manufacturers group, so take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but I think that some core elements here are true, and that is that there's a huge number of compounds that come out of drug discovery, both in academic labs and in industry labs. Of these, the more promising go into preclinical development, and then very few of those actually make it in the clinical trial phase. And of those that get into clinical trial phase in phase 1, maybe only 20% will make it into two positive phase 3 trials and result in a new molecular entity or a Me Too drug and marketing. So the basic scientists who have their own pet molecule and wonder why it's not going forward more quickly don't understand the complexity of what's needed to pass through the clinical trial phase with toxicity studies and also the number of promising agents that fall by the wayside due to unexpected rare side effects or other vehicle delivery difficulties or other problems. So it's because of the need for expertise in this translational period of a sort that only companies that have a big silo of compounds coming through all the time can do, that there emerges a distinctive role for industry in clinical trials. Now, here, to give a preview of where I think I'll end up, this is a diagram that Jeff Flyer published just last month in Journal of Clinical Investigation, where all of the contretemps in the literature over who should get credit for drug discovery in advance, and the basic science advocates say NIH is funding our exploratory science and we're doing all the work and industry is stealing it, and industry is saying we are doing all the pivotal trials and we're the engine of change. And I think that there's no need to fight over it. There's more than enough credit to go around, and they each have their key roles, and that academia does the fundamental research more primarily, and does provide clinical disease experts and clinical trial performance experts for the next phase, whereas pharma and biotech do hard work in developing the toxicity and delivery systems for the drug, validating the molecules, doing practical preclinical model testing, and carrying out the clinical trials. Now, people usually talk about those two entities, but I think it's really the case that it's best to conceive of the clinical trial ecosystem as having three entities. There's the drug and device companies, there's the academics, but now there's also the clinical research organizations, because most large biopharma and device companies farm out many aspects of their performance of clinical trials to companies that specialize in doing clinical trials for many different companies, these contract research organizations. And they are now worth more than $21 billion. There are now more than 1,100 contract research organizations over the world. Here you see a history of their evolution. And if you look at who's really knows how to run trials and is conducting them, a lot of that has migrated to the CROs, and it's really a tripartite world out there between the industry sponsors, the CROs who are interested in study conduct, and the academicians who are interested in study conduct and interpretation. The CROs sometimes have different incentives than industry does, but if you're going to be an academic working in these big clinical trials, you have to understand and work well with the CROs as well as the industry sponsors. Well, let's talk about some of the data about industry trials versus academic trials, and look at what the data actually show us in the current environment. Because it's a little bit different than the all industry is bad and all academics is good perspective that often gets breeded about. Here's some data looking at in the first couple of years in Europe, when the European Drug Agency required trials to report the results of their final results in a public registry. FDA has done the same thing here in the US. In the US, trials are now required to report their results within a year of being completed on clinicaltrials.gov. And in Europe, EMA required trials to report their results on a public website within a year of their being completed. And here you can see the rate at which results were being published in each year from 2006 to 2015, and you can see that 80 to 90% of the industry trials in purple, blue, and yellow were being reported their results within 1 year, whereas only 35 to 40% of non-industry trials were being reported. And this reflects the academics have less resources to get results out there. They are less knowledgeable about the regulatory environment and the need to be reporting. But it's one example where actually industry rather than academics are doing better in trial conduct and reporting. Here's another study that looked at what predicted whether there would be a report or not, and found that industry had an odds ratio of reporting 23-fold compared to non-industry, and also sponsors who have many trials, much more knowledgeable about this framework, report much more frequently than sponsors who have few trials. There are studies that have looked at the likelihood of having a positive trial result and whether that's associated with industry funding or with academic funding. And in general, there does tend to be more positive trials with industry funding. Here's a large study from a couple of years ago where they looked at 500 trials in JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and Lancet in a 3-year period. And they found that the effect size, the rate of good outcomes in the active intervention group compared with the control group, was higher in industry trials, odds ratio of 1.92, than it was in trials that were not industry funding or were mixed between industry and academic. And that mainly seemed to be driven by the use of surrogate endpoints more often in industry trials. And so this reflects that the skeptics would say that maybe this reflects bias, that industry is not reporting positive and negative trials, but I think now in the registration area, that's no longer the case. What I think it more reflects two things. First, industry tends to design for success, and they are willing to have bunt singles and small incremental positive results in favor of the drug they own, and they'll use surrogate endpoints, even though it might not be a transformative trial. It's a trial that would help with in a niche way with their advancing their agent, and so they will design trials that you can predict beforehand are more likely to succeed, and they do succeed more often. It's also probably a little bit better quality than industry trials, and that also helps to encourage success. But I think it's more the targeting whether you're going for the big swing with your trial or trying to move your agent along the basis. Here's another study now looking at trial quality and the notion that industry does poor quality and academics do high quality. There are several studies now that show that it actually has it completely on its head, that on average industry trials, if you apply the Cochrane ROB 2.0 risk of bias analysis or any other quality scale to clinical trials, on average clinical trials will do better than academic trials. Here's a study of 200 trials in high impact factor journals, looking at whether there was industry funding, academic funding, or both. And industry collaboration was associated with higher quality, not just industry funding, but active industry collaboration with academic was associated with higher quality features, more use of intention to treat analysis, and of more use of blinding of study participants and raters. And in this study, it was associated with the same rate of positive outcomes. There was no difference in the frequency of positive outcomes for industry versus collaboration versus no collaboration. Here's an older study that our group did where we looked at all the acute stroke trials in the 20th century. This reflects more the bad old days. And we looked at 178 acute ischemic stroke trials that tested 75 agents. And we found that industry actually had, and this surprised us at the time, I expected that the quality of industry trials would be worse than academic, but we found that on a 100-point scale, the quality score of primary results reports of industry trials was higher than non-industry trials. On the other hand, we did find a trend to a greater lag in reporting of neutral or negative results versus positive results trials in industry trials. It took 2.8 years between the last patient visit to the publication of a neutral or negative trial versus 2.1 years for a positive trial. So, and that was more pronounced in industry than in. Lastly, here's another look at, again, a somewhat disappearing practice, but from the recent old days of guest authorship in clinical trials. And this was an analysis of 169 randomized trials published in high impact journals, impact factor greater than 11, from 2011 to 2012, and looking at whether there was pure academic conduct or industry funding alone, or industry funding and active industry collaboration in trial performance. And guest authorship was defined as the author contribution section of the manuscript, saying that neither the first nor the last academic author of the paper contributed to trial design or data analysis or wrote the first draft of the paper. And industry funding with collaboration, so the stronger industry involvement in the trial, was associated. Indeed, it was the only setting in which guest authorship was seen to occur. This is harder to have happen now in 2019, as some of the leading journals have gone to rules that they will only accept papers if the first draft was written by an academic author. So with that overview of the actual data about advantages and disadvantages of industry conducted or partially conducted trials versus academic, let me talk about roles for academics to play in industry trials. And there's a wide variety. Of course, being a site investigator or co-investigator at performance site in industry trials is something that virtually every clinical researcher in the neurology in the country does. So in a sense, you have thousands of neurologists who are in partnership with industry at the site investigator level. Then moving up to trial leadership, they're serving on the steering committee, serving as overall principal investigator. Often independent academics are specifically recruited for steering committee and principal investigator roles to give the trial credibility, to serving on the data safety and monitoring board or the clinical events adjudication committee, serving on publication committees after the trial is completed, especially overseeing secondary manuscripts, which often generate more novel academic directions than the pre-specified primary manuscripts, and serving as authors on the variety of manuscripts that come out of major clinical trials, all roles for academics in industry trials. And there's a wide range to governance of large clinical trials between academics and industry. Sometimes the trials are completely or nearly completely academic directed, and it might be that industry provides funding for the trial and the agent for the trial, but turns it over to an independent academic group like the TIMI group at Harvard or the McMaster group in Canada. And that well-established group will then run the trial in a almost completely separate way. The TIMI groups run nearly 60 trials over 20 years. And that brings high credibility with diminished industry involvement. Then there's also trials where there's funding for performance from the National Institute of Health or from non-governmental organizations and charities, but the industry supplies the agent for the trial free of charge, like the NINDS-TPA trials. This is a common NIH mechanism of getting some contribution by industry simply by providing agent or device. Then in between, there's a shared oversight model where the steering committee might have both academic and industry members who are voting members. Publications from the trial might have industry authors in addition to academic authors. I actually think that that is better than having industry playing an important role in trial conduct, but then not having an industry member on the authorship, which is really not true to the spirit of how the trial was conducted. I think it's better in that situation to have industry authors. Another step further away is where the academic steering committee is really advisory to the sponsor and does not have a full control and authority over trial conduct, but advises the sponsor on trial conduct. This happens especially in device trials, and it can be hard in reading the report of a particular clinical trial to determine whether it was a trial in which the steering committee actually was in control of the trial or was merely advisory regarding the trial. And then finally, there's the uncommon, but they do sometimes happen, trials in which industry is completely in charge. There is no academic steering committee, although there might be academics at individual performance sites. How often do we see these different types of approaches? Here's a study from the British Medical Journal that was influential last year, where they looked at 200 trials from 2014 to 2017. And here looking at different domains, trial design, trial conduct, data analysis, and paper writing and reporting. And you can see the frequency with which different combinations of the sponsor, the CRO, and academics were involved. And if you look at funder only, you can see that that dark blue, it's in the data analysis phase. Often the data analysis is done by statisticians who are full-time employees of the company, who are hired by the company to do the data analysis, and usually in response and interaction with a writing committee or steering committee who are asking about analyses. But this is a remaining place where the paranoid worry that the statistician who's actually accessing the data set is an employee or payee of the company and not of the sponsor, and that maybe some shenanigans are taking place, and the academic authors don't see the raw data, they only see the processed data. However, the data is subject to audit by FDA and independent regulators, so I think that the likelihood that despite the paranoid suspicions out there on some bad pharma websites, the likelihood that any shenanigans are taking place at that stage are very low. And my experience has always been that I could ask for additional analyses and keep on pressing to understand the data as much as I wish before I felt comfortable with reporting a study result, and the findings would hold up with repeated queries. If you look at the specific decisions made by these different players in terms of what is the active agent going to be compared to, what's the choice of the primary outcome, the final say on design, the final say on the drafted manuscript, and the final say on the published manuscript. And you can see that in the early arc of a trial life, the choice of comparator, outcome, and design, industry is playing a very substantial role, with also academics often involved. But as you reach the end of the study and analysis and writing the manuscript, then the academics are being given the final say. So another difference between industry trials and non-industry trials is the type of interventions that they study. Industry focuses on new drugs for which there is a patent, so they can have proprietary control, and new devices for which there is a patent, for which they can have proprietary control. In contrast, NIH and non-governmental funders will tend to focus on older off-patent drugs because first, they don't have access to the new patent drugs, plus there's a feeling that if there's a new on-patent drug that a company is going to be making money from, the company should be spending the investment to do the trial. NIH should save its taxpayer dollars for trials for the public good that industry won't itself fund, and so they tend to focus on older agents that may not have, where new questions may have come up, or before the patent life expired, questions hadn't been fully answered, and there's no industry funder around anymore who will fund these trials, and that's where NIH and the charitable funders will step in. Both end up doing some first-in-class agents, although the later in class is a difference. Industry does many more later in class Me Too type trials against control to try and get new drugs registered. This is against inactive controls, and this is a common criticism of industry trials, that too much of it is Me Too trials, although in clinical practice, having 3 to 5 or 6 agents within a class often, as we all know, is very helpful because each of the agents has its own dosing frequency or side effect profile, and being able to have a choice among them can be helpful at the bedside. In contrast, industry tends not to fund active in-class agent versus active in-class agent trials, where because there's a high risk that their drug will not be shown to be superior to an active comparator as opposed to an inactive comparator, and those types of head-to-head within-class trials tend to happen with NIH or charitable funding. For non-industry trials, somewhat uniquely, are surgical interventions where there's no patentable device, a new surgical technique that has to go to non-industry funding, and also systems of care trials where you're testing a new way of organizing an intensive care unit or a new way of organizing ambulance routing. Those are the types of implementation studies, step wedge and other cluster control trials that tends to have non-industry sponsors because there's not a industry agents that's specifically involved. And then finally is the orphan disease category, and it used to be that The non-industry trials were the only place you could go for orphan disease studies because there wasn't a big enough market for industry to be involved. But now in the US, with regulations allowing high monetary reward for small allotment drugs, industry is beginning to wade into the orphan disease category. Most notably, just last month, in this regard, is a neurologic drug, Zolgensma, which is for spinal muscular atrophy, which is an orphan disease, only 360 new cases annually in the US, so it meets the FDA criteria of less than 8,000 cases a year for being an orphan disease. And this drug, which is a combination of the survival motor neuron gene plus a viral vector, it's a genetic one of the very first genetic therapies to change the genetic structure of cells in these patients, was approved last month by FDA and is now on the market by Novartis, and the price per patient is $2 million. And that's what's needed to have, I suppose, a for-profit response to this orphan disease category. And there's a lot of sticker shock going around in the halls of Washington and other places about this planned marketing strategy. But if you can charge $2 million a dose, you can afford to have a development program for a disease that only has 360 patients a year. It is important to be aware of the different cultures of academia and industry when the two come together. Academia has a public mission, is curiosity driven, is more focused on publications as coin of the realm rather than profit and dollars and sales, is more oriented to open source and sharing of knowledge, and prioritizes investigator needs and academic careers, education and academic freedom. On the other end, industry is more organized to shareholder value and revenue. And it's important when you're working with industry to recognize that they have a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders. Their first legal responsibility is to their stockholders, and once you understand that that's the case, then you know what to expect and you can work around that. They are much more immediate results driven, a shorter time horizon. They're much more nimble in making decision making than the slow grant process with NIH. They are focused on protected innovation, where there's proprietary opportunities. They don't share knowledge as much, but both the university and industry cultures meet in needing to create and wanting to create societal value. The people who work for industry are also looking to do the public good, as well as their company good. They both are concerned about their brands, the university brand and the company brand. They are both share commitment to science, sharing knowledge, finding cures, tackling big questions. So we can bring together these different cultures in a knowledgeable way to take advantage of their strengths and weaknesses. So here's one suggestion for how industry academic partnerships can work together. And the academics have key roles to play in key intellectual aspects of trial conduct. Industry and CROs have the resources and the greater experience with the running of trials on a global scale and maintaining trial quality. And between that warp and woof, the two can work together to get trials done well. I'll tell to illustrate the range of interactions that can occur, some war stories, because when you're an academic working with industry, you will see, you do spend time in the gray zone where things are happening that you would not have expected. When you get some academic clinical trialists together who work with industry, late at night at the meetings when we go into the back room and start tossing the drinks back and we start telling stories about things we have seen. Here are a few of my stories. The first is not one that, well, the first one, I was a site investigator in a trial in the 1990s of serving a neuroprotective drug for stroke, where poor Wayne Clark, who was the academic PI working with this company, which had a primary results platform presentation at the big national meeting, and the day before the meeting, the company had seen that the results were neutral, told him that they did not want to present the results, and very bravely he came out, went to the podium at his scheduled time and said, the company has told me I can't present the results, which was an eloquent non-presentation illustrating the unfortunate decision of the company. Even worse, about a decade later, there was a trial that we were also a site in where developing a laser therapy device for stroke, where the company, after running a phase 3 trial, broke the code, saw that the results were neutral, and immediately declared bankruptcy. And they did not pay the sites what was left on their clinical trial contracts, and they were not going to report the results or do anything with the data. They just fled. And in a great example of academic commitment, the academic investigators, unpaid, reconstructed the database and published the primary results. Another example, I was on the steering committee for a trial being done by a small device company. A lot of the small companies don't really understand the full protections needed in clinical trials, and they were telling us at an early steering committee meeting that they had looked at the results and it was trending in a certain direction, but they hadn't calculated a p-value, so they thought they were allowed to look behind the blind as long as a p-value was not calculated. And after recovering from our shock, we told them you can't do that again, and admonished them and told them we'd walk away if it happened again. Another example is we had a drug company that tripled the price of the drug that we were testing in a clinical trial was used for more severe indication, and we thought it was important to highlight that this needless increase in the drug price was being done by the company. And so we originally started writing up the members of the steering committee, but then we realized that the company would be very upset with continuing to fund the current trial that we were leading if all of us reported and exposed them. So we divided into a good cop, bad cop group and had certain members of the steering committee not be on the paper so that they could stay on the company's good graces, and the rest of us were on the paper so we could make sure the word got out there. I'll skip to the last one to show you that it can go the other way. Sometimes the companies are right and the academics are wrong. I was on a steering committee for a phase 3 device trial, and several years into the trial conduct and only about a year before planned trial end, the sponsors came to us and said they had finished additional analysis of the prior trial, and they kept seeing that one particular subgroup was really responding, and they wanted to change the, still blinded, but change the analysis so that 2 primary populations would be analyzed, not just all enrolled patients, but also as a multiple primary population, the subgroup that had responded in the pilot trial. And the steering committee gave them the standard counsel of clinical trialists everywhere that you should not over-respond to subgroup effects seen in pilot trials, that they often are false signals and you'll be diluting your study power in the overall group if you spend some of your alpha on this subgroup. It's not good to go chasing after alpha. Don't do it. And the sponsor said, we appreciate your advice, but we're going to do it. We feel strongly about it. And so we were in an advisory position on this study. So we understood that. We said, we've cautioned you, but it's your $30 million you're spending on this trial, so that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. And then when we broke code, we found out the sponsor was absolutely right. There was minimal effect in the overall population, but there was a positive effect in the subgroup they had designated. This trial was just published in Lancet last month. And it was because the sponsor overruled the academic steering committee that we had a positive, a near positive trial there. Now, besides these approaches to governance of individual trials, I'll mention that there are a variety of other academic industry partnerships being developed in the US and abroad, where individual universities and individual drug companies are partnering in a particular disease area, and they're sharing preclinical data, or they're sharing big data out of electronic medical records, or a variety of other approaches for general strategic partnerships. And sometimes these are open and transparent data sharing arrangements. Sometimes they're closed between the partners. And whether this type of really embedded co-discovery and drug development is going to be a successful approach or not is we don't know yet, but it is a new model that's emerging. So I'll close here by saying that if you understand the different goals and values and criteria for success of the for-profit drug companies and CROs and the nonprofit academic mission, if you can walk that tightrope, then you can take the engine of trial performance, that is industry, and put it in the service of the most promising agents. The Kenny Rogers quote here is apt. You got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them, know when to walk away and know when to run. Often the only leverage that the academics on a clinical trial have is to tell the sponsor, I so strongly disagree with this that I will resign and walk away, and then the field will know that some valued individual, respected individual washed their hands of a trial, and that actually has a lot of leverage over the sponsor. So usually things don't come to a final pass where you need to be ready to make that declaration and be ready to walk, but every so often it does have to happen. But usually close collaboration from the earliest possible time in the life of a trial is the more usual experience and a very effective way to take the information and experience that you gain as an academic clinical trialist and put it on the widest canvas in industry trials. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
Dr. Saver, this is Will Moyer. Thank you for a really interesting and great presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Will.
One question that I would have is, what experiences or, I guess, process do you think is the best way for people early in their careers as clinician scientists to get involved with industry?
Sure. Well, I think, the usual and generally very effective approach is to start by being a site investigator or site sub-investigator on a clinical trial, but go to the initial investigator meetings, see how participate actively in discussions about trial design and implementation, see how industry is thinking about the study, and then you can become involved in different trial conduct, leadership opportunities that come up. Often there'll be special working groups that are put together to improve recruitment or address issues within a trial, and if you show energy and interest, you can join those. And then when the trial ends, although the primary paper authorship is usually determined well in advance, coming from the overall steering committee, there will generally be many secondary papers that are wide open for anyone with initiative and interest to lead or serve as a co-author on, and then that gives you a chance to work with these data sets and work with both the industry and the academic trial leaders and see what the framework is like. And then if you started at that level in the first trials, when the next industry trial is coming along, someone from the industry side or from the more senior academic side, when they're looking for trial leaders for the next one, will remember your activities and gradually move you up the echelon to trial leadership. Yeah, I'll also mention, and I didn't put a slide in this, that there's the academic investigator-initiated trial pathway, where investigators can propose studies to industry for industry funding, often as a single or small center studies, typically up to $50,000 to $100,000 for a couple of years, although sometimes much bigger. And that also can be a way to become involved if you have an interesting idea and it's testing a proprietary agent, so it's going to be something that industry will want to fund, not something that NIH will want to fund. Then all the big pharma and device companies have a formal pathway for submitting investigator-initiated protocols and an internal process for scientifically reviewing those and awarding them. And that also is another good way to get involved in this space.
All right. Anybody else in the group have any additional questions? You all can see over in the chat box, Joy has the link where you can evaluate today's webinar. Joy, did you have any other closing statements?
No, I just want to thank Dr. Saver again for presenting today, and that our next webinar is next week on July 2nd at noon Eastern on data and safety and AE reporting. So I hope everyone can join then as well.
Yeah, please add that to your calendars from the email that Joy will send. You have to click on the attachment to get that plopped onto your calendar. So great.
All right, thank you, Dr. Saver, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care. Thanks.